In this video, we're going to continue with our properties of functions, and we're looking at extrema. Extrema are simply the maximums and minimum points that are found on the graph. We can have relative or local extrema, max or mins, which means that there is a section of the graph where it is a maximum or a minimum, or we can have what we refer to as an absolute max or min, which means that it is the highest or lowest point on the graph. Taking a look at the graph, we will assume that this graph continues down on both sides here. So the graph goes down forever, which means it cannot have an absolute minimum, but it can have some local minimums. The graph does have a highest point, which would be an absolute maximum. It also has another high point, which means that it has a local maximum as well. So looking here, we have the point R. This would be an absolute max. And then over here we have the point P, and point P would be a local or a relative max. And then also down here we have Q, which is going to be a local min. If we go back to point R for a minute, this is an absolute max. It's also considered a relative max. So any point that is an absolute maximum or minimum is also considered a relative maximum or minimum. So looking at some examples here, we just want to classify the extrema on this graph. Again, assume that when you get a graph, you're given the graph that's showing all important features. So since this graph is going off of the graph paper there, we're going to assume that it continues in that direction. If it were to be changing direction, that would be an important feature of the graph, and so they would show us that. So this graph seems to have two extrema. It has a point here, and we would classify this as a relative max. Since the graph is going up forever, we do not have an absolute maximum. If we just approximate this point from the graph, we would say that this relative max is at the point -2, I'm going to approximate 11 there. At this point here, we have what we would call a relative min. And again, if we approximate this relative min, this is going to be at the point for, let's say, -46. Keep in mind that sometimes they'll ask you to give the maximum or minimum value, which means the y-coordinate of the point, and sometimes they'll ask you where the maximum or minimum occurs, and that's going to be the x value or the x-coordinate of the point. And then sometimes they will just ask for the point which represents the max or min. So you need to pay attention to your directions. On this second graph over here, again, we're going to continue that we have all important features of this graph. So this is going to continue to the left and to the right, approaching the axis, but never crossing it. If we're going to cross it, then that would be an important point that they would have shown you on the graph. So again, we have a point right here, which we would refer to. This is a local or a relative max, but also an absolute max. And if we approximate this point, this is the point 1, 0.5. And then over here, we have an absolute min, and that seems to be at the point -1, -0.5. Remember that if you are given an equation, you can graph those equations on your calculator, and you can use your max and min features from your calculator to help you find the points if you need them.